Did you ever wonder what NX means? Like what extensible dev tool for monorepo is actually all about? So this video, we are going to explore NX. We're going to set up a new workspace with React, Cypress, and Storybook. So let's get started. So if you go to the nx.dev website, you can actually just click on that Get Started button, which will then propose you to choose between those two frameworks. Now this time we will choose React, and we will directly come to a page which explains basically what NX is about, what its main advantages, what monorepos are, and how you can get started. But let's just move over to our terminal and get started. So what we can do is actually install the NX CLI globally, or what I often prefer is just to use the npx command. So we can say nx create nx workspace, and then we will give it the name of our workspace. In this case, I'm just naming it my organization. So once that is installed, you will see some kind of wizard, which will present you a couple of presets that set up your workspace with some predefined configurations. So you can either go with an empty workspace and add them by yourself, but in this case, for instance, I'm going to choose React. Here we'll get asked about an application name that will be generated for us. So let's just call it demo app for now. And also we can choose between different style formats. So you can use CSS, Sass style, style components, or whatever you prefer. And so I'm just going ahead with CSS. So once this workspace is set up, let's just cd into it, my org. And we can see now we have a couple of setups already generated, like we have the node modules, we have package JSON file, tsconfig file generated for us. So let's just open it and Visual Studio Code or whatever you prefer. So when you open up that new workspace, you can see here its structure. What is particular about an NX workspace setup is that it has some predefined folders. For instance, we have that app folder, which contains, for instance, the demo app we generated just before. It contains a libraries folder, where our libraries will be generated in. We'll see that in a couple of minutes. And then we have some things which you might already know. We have predefined setup for an editor config. We have an ESLint configuration set up for us here. And then there is something more particular, which is that Workspace Json, which is basically a kind of a configuration file which describes your workspace and the applications which live within it. For instance, if you open up that node here, you can see there is a node projects. And inside that projects node, the various projects which we have in our workspace are being listed. For instance, our demo app here is defined in this node here. You can see here where the root of it is, where the source root starts, the type of the project, which in this case is an application, but it might as well be a library, which are being placed down there. And then we have that architect node, which basically defines how our application is being built, how it's being served, linted, tested, and etc. You could potentially extend it with custom behavior as well. So for now, let's just start that application that NX generated for us. So this is a very simple React application. And of course, we can just go to the package JSON and we have that start script already pre-generated. So NX serve will actually take care then of setting up that default project, which in this case is that demo app which we generated. So let's just open up that integrated terminal here and do a yarn start or npm start, depending on what you're using. So you can now see at localhost 4200, our application will be served. So let's just move over to a browser. Let's open localhost 4200, and you can see our application being rendered. So let's go a bit further and generate a new library, which we will then want to use in our demo application. So to generate new assets, NX uses a mechanism called Schematics, and Schematics allow you to generate new code. They also allow you to modify existing code. As an example, for instance, NX uses those schematics for migrating your workspace to new versions. So whenever a new version of NX comes out, you can just actually execute that update command, which will then migrate to the latest version and also adjust basically your package JSON, migrate existing code and port it such that basically breaking changes are automatically fixed for you. So in order to explore what are the different capabilities, you can actually go here and do NX list. Note, if you have NX installed globally, you can just execute NX list rather than yarn NX list. And so in that case, what you see is the different kind of community plugins which we have. You can also see the different NX plugins that are already available. And in our case, we want to actually use Novel React. And so we can say yarn NX list Novel React in order to explore the capabilities of that specific package. And so we can see that Novel React comes with different kind of schematics. First of all, to initialize basically the whole Novel React plugin, it allows you to generate an application, libraries, also React components, and a couple of other things which we might explore. So in our specific case, let's use yarn nx generate at Novel React, and we want to generate a new library. If you pass in the --help, we'll now see specifically how that command looks like. So here are the various options that are being explained, and so you can pass them in one by one in order to customize what is being generated in the end. Now, if you're not the console type of person, or you don't want to type them manually out, you can also install NX Console. What NX Console will allow us is to basically have a graphical user interface for all those commands. So in our case, we choose for React library. We can say our library, let's call it greeter library. You can see immediately we get a dry run of what would be generated with those setups. Let's just scroll over them. For instance, styles, we will just leave them CSS for now. We can place that in a shared directory, for instance, under the lib folder. And then we have a couple of other options, whether component should be initialized, whether you want to use plain JavaScript, the linter you want to use, and a couple of other things. So for now we are good. So just press that run button. And now the actual schematic will run. If you go back to our Explorer here, we will see now the library folder has changed, and we actually got a shared folder here and a new greeter folder down below, which has already basically a greeter component generated for us. So we can now go ahead and use that in our application. So if you go to our demo application, let's go to the app component here. And for now, let's just remove that whole main section, which got generated by the next setup. And let's use our new component. So first of all, I'm going to import that shared greeter here, and I'm going to import that from my organization shared greeter. And you can see that there has already been set up a TypeScript path mapping that already points to our shared greeter library, which we just generated. So from there, I can basically import that shared greeter, go down here, and actually generate that. Let's again run our application. And now if we go back and refresh, we can now see that our component gets properly rendered. Now let's make this slightly more interesting in that we add some properties here. So let's call that like person name, which is of type string. Since we're using TypeScript, we can actually type that. I can do shared greeter, and we can now use props.personName. Again, back in our app TSX, we can pass that in. And let's call it Yuri for now. And so we can see that automatically gets rebuilt and gets reflected whatever we change in our component. So one interesting part which you want to explore in this video especially is the Cypress support that comes with NX. So you might have noticed that our application here has already an end-to-end folder generated just beneath it. And that's actually a fully functional setup of Cypress together with some initial test case which verifies the correct functioning of our application. And so we can actually run that Cypress test by invoking it. And so in order to invoke it, we run yarn nx run. We give it the name of the project, demo app end-to-end, and the target we want to execute. Now, in order to understand what the target is about, let's quickly jump to that Workspace Json. And if you go for projects here, we can actually open up the demo end-to-end folder here. And you can see that the architect here has a target end-to-end specified, which has Cypress as its builder, meaning that whenever we invoke that command here, Cypress will be used in the background. It will get these options, it will configure it based on that, and basically launch the Cypress test for us. And so if you go back now, we actually want to run the demo end-to-end project, which is this one here. And we want to use the target end-to-end defined here in our architect file. Furthermore, let's just here use headless for now. So no UI will open up, and basically just the headless browser will be used for testing our application. All right, as you can see, like the test has been executed and they all pass properly. Now, an interesting part is that we can also configure the same thing here for our library. Especially if you create shared UI components, for instance, like a common application-wide design component library, you might want to test those components individually. And Storybook is actually a very good candidate for doing so. Now what we can do is we can use one of those NX generators again, and we can go for Storybook and choose here React Storybook configuration. So this will set up a storybook for a given React library. So let's just choose here this one. So in this generator, we need to give it the library name, which basically should be augmented or pre-configured with Storybook. Now in our case, that is basically our reader library. Now, since it is in a subfolder, it is basically prefixed with that shared in front of that. Again, we can verify that in the Workspace Json. So if you close here, you can see now we have the demo app end-to-end, but we also have here the project type library, which is our shared reader, which we generated. And you can see that the name of the project is always prefixed by its folder structure. And so we want to use that shared reader here. And we want to generate stories for our components. And we also want to configure basically that setup with Cypress. And so let's just click the run button. You can now see we get a warning here that the command cannot be executed because we didn't actually install in our Storybook package. So let's just pre-install that. And so once that Storybook is installed, we can just now click the run button again. We will give it that we want to use the Cypress spec, generate Cypress specs as well. Now, if you go back to our setup here, we see that we now got a Storybook folder with some pre-configuration of Storybook. And if we open up the source folder, we also see that we got a new story generated for our component. And so basically, we get here our shared reader imported. We get also some properties already predefined with some person name, for instance, here. We can just provide the default with Yuri and the actual component that's being rendered here as a JSX. So let's now launch that Storybook configuration. Again, if we go to the Workspace Json and we go to our shared reader, we'll now see that we have an additional target here, which is Storybook, that got installed when we added here the Storybook configuration. And so now what we can do in our command line, we can say nx run shared reader, and we want to run this Storybook target. And so now on port 4400, we can now see that our component gets loaded up. We can also modify it. And we see that it gets dynamically reflected to our component. So that allows us to test our component and explore what we have in our workspace. Now, since we have our component here in perfect isolation, it would be a great occasion also to test that in that isolation. And Cypress is a good candidate here as well. So if you remember previously, we actually, when we generated that Storybook configuration, we also confirmed that we want Cypress tests to be generated automatically for us. And so what that did is actually in that app folder up here, it generated a new end-to-end folder project here, which is Cypress setup, specifically for our shared reader library. If we open up here, we can also see that we got a shared reader spec generated for us, which basically loads up here Storybook. It provides here some basically pre-configuration for that knobs, in this case person name, so that will be the properties of the React component. So again, here we can pass in Yuri, and then we can see here the actual verification. So whenever the component renders, it should say welcome to shared reader. In this case, since we have provided Yuri, it should look something like that. And so what this means, we can now actually also execute Cypress on our shared reader based on a Storybook which we generated. So we can do nx run shared reader end-to-end, which is a project that got generated for us, and the end-to-end target, which always means Cypress. Again, let's use headless. And you can now see how Cypress was executed in the background. It executed our component test by using Storybook and verified that those asserts basically match the expectations. You can, of course, always pass in the various options you can pass to Cypress itself. So instead of headless mode, we can actually also go into watch mode, which is particularly useful if you develop your component. And so you want to have maybe Cypress run in parallel in the background and continuously verify whether your component works. And so that gives us that Cypress test runner. And so we can click on that test case here, which will be executed in Cypress. And you can see how the component gets loaded here. You can inspect it, you can adjust it, and basically work from there. So one of the strengths of NX is that it has been built and designed from the ground up to work at scale. And that means that it is designed to work in large monorepos with a lot of applications and libraries, and it knows how those applications and libraries interact with each other. As a consequence, NX built a so-called dependency graph, which you can actually also see when you run yarn dep graph, which is a script in your package JSON, which will open up this visualization of the dependency graph NX builds for you. And so you can see here we have that demo application, we have that shared greeter library our demo application depends on, as well as our two end-to-end tests. Now you can organize those graphs here depending on your needs, especially if that grows larger in a larger monorepo. It is really handy to filter out the various sections. And so the important part of that graph is that behind the scenes, NX now has a so-called affected command, which allows you to just build, test, lint, or whatever you want to do, basically, of what actually changed. Because imagine you have a really large enterprise workspace here, an enterprise monorepo, and on each CI run, you actually don't want to build all of the applications and all of the libraries. You just want to build whatever has been changed, whatever has been affected by your changes on that PR. And NX is actually able to figure that out via that dependency graph. And so what we can do, for instance, we can execute affected test. And you can see now basically that it will run the demo up and the shared greeter. Now our shared greeter even has here an error. So let's go into our spec file here. And let's provide here just a name, just to make it pass. So we can run it again. And now all our tests pass. The interesting part here is that if I run them again, NX immediately returns output. As you can see also there's a node, NX read the output from the cache. So what happens here is NX not only optimizes it with the affected commands in terms that it just builds whatever has been changed, but it also has an internal computational cache that allows you to not basically re-execute commands on the same source if nothing actually changed. So we didn't actually touch the greeter library nor the help library, and so there's no point in actually rebuilding them or retesting them. NX can just read them out of the cache and just present it back to the user. That local computational cache is actually highly valuable because it increases dramatically the performance of your local runs. Because actually you would never run the same command twice whenever you didn't change the source code underneath. This whole cache gets even more valuable if you could distribute that among your teammates. So imagine you could actually build or run this command here, which we just did, like the test run. And if you pushed it up to a repository and someone else on your team basically checks out the same source code and runs that command again, it would actually also get the cache output directly rather than running the commands. And so you could actually improve the speed and the performance of the workspace of your teammates. So if that sounds interesting, definitely go to nx.app and check out NX Cloud. So what NX Cloud does is it allows you to register here for an account. You can get different kind of tokens, which you can then place on your CI system or your local developer workstations. And so whenever your CI builds some specific source and the same source code is checked out by some developer, he would actually benefit from that cache. And the same thing holds also if some other teammate builds the same source code already before you, you would not have to execute it again on your machine.